The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Hargreave Capital smelled like leather and money, and something colder than both, the particular tension of men who were about to lose a great deal of one and didn't know it yet. Callum Hargreave stood at the head of the table with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which meant things had already gone sideways before 9 in the morning. He was 53, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had photographs taken with prime ministers and kept them in his credenza instead of on the wall, because he didn't need to show anyone what he already knew. His company had built half the commercial infrastructure in Western Canada and was 2 signatures away from the largest private contract in Quebec's history, a 47-year lease on a network of hydroelectric corridors that would reshape the energy grid from the Laurentians to James Bay. 2 signatures, that was all, except that Gérard Fontaine, the lead negotiator for the Consortium Québécois d'Énergie, had arrived from Montreal that morning speaking almost exclusively in rapid, heavily accented French peppered with the kind of legal and technical vocabulary that Hargreave's lead translator, a sharp, meticulous man named Paul Okafor, had been perfectly equipped to handle. Had been past tense. Paul was currently in Michael's hospital with a ruptured appendix that had declared itself at 6:47 that morning, during what was supposed to be a preparatory call. He'd apparently pushed through the first 90 minutes of the call before his assistant heard him make a sound no person should make during a business negotiation, and called an ambulance. The backup translator they'd brought in from the agency downtown had taken one look at Fontaine's opening position. Delivered in the specific legal French of Quebec civil law, laced with references to the civil code and the Régie de l'Énergie that needed not just translation but deep contextual fluency, and had asked, very quietly, whether Hargreave had a different requirement in mind. Then he'd gathered his portfolio, apologized with his eyes more than his mouth, and left. That was 40 minutes ago. Now Fontaine sat across the table from Hargreave with 3 of his own people, a cup of tea going cold in front of him, and an expression of polite patience that was running visibly thin. His junior associate, a young woman named Isabelle, kept glancing at her phone. Not checking it, looking at the time. "Monsieur Hargreave," Fontaine said, for the 3rd time that morning. Hargreave understood enough French to know they had a flight at 5. He didn't understand enough French to close a 40-year hydroelectric lease. His assistant, Priya, appeared at his elbow. She had the expression of someone delivering news they've already mentally apologized for. "I've called every agency on the list. The earliest anyone can get here with the right specialization is Thursday." Thursday was 4 days away. Fontaine had a flight at 5. "There has to be something," Hargreave said, and he said it quietly enough that only Priya could hear the edge under it. "I'm still calling." She paused. This is going to sound strange. Priya. The catering order came up from downstairs. The woman who delivered it, she was talking to Marco in the hallway, and she translated something he said to one of Monsieur Fontaine's associates. Apparently without thinking about it. Marco said it was accurate. Hargreave looked at her for a long moment. "The catering delivery person. I know, you want me to. I don't want you to do anything, I'm just telling you what I heard." He straightened his cuffs, looked at Fontaine, who was now studying the middle distance with the particular stillness of a man who was deciding whether he was being disrespected, looked back at Priya. "Get her." Wren Mackay was trying to decide whether the insulated bag she was carrying had left a permanent red mark on her shoulder when the executive assistant caught her in the hallway and said, in a slightly too controlled voice, that Mr. Hargreave would like to speak with her for a moment. She almost said no. That was the thing she'd think about later. She'd almost said no, because she had 3 more deliveries before noon, and the traffic on Bay Street was going to be a disaster by 11, and she was wearing her work clothes, which were a Montreal Catering Co. polo shirt in a size that fit her actual body, rather than the body someone had apparently decided delivery workers should have, and dark trousers with a scuff on the left knee from where she'd knelt to pick up a dropped tray of macarons on Tuesday. She didn't say no. She said, "Sure, 1 second," set the insulated bag down by the wall, and followed the assistant down a carpeted hallway that cost more per square foot than her apartment. The boardroom was the kind of room that was designed to communicate a specific and unmistakable thing about the people who owned it. Floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Ontario spread out below like hammered pewter in the October light, a table that could seat 20, currently seating 8, and every single one of those 8 people looking at her. Wren had grown up in Moncton. She'd done a year of science at UNB before her mother got sick, come back home, stayed longer than she meant to, moved to Toronto at 26 with a practical knowledge base that existed almost entirely in her head and very little on paper. She was 31 now. She was carrying an extra 40 pounds she'd put on during 3 years of hospital-adjacent stress and 2 years of trying to get her feet under her financially, and she was standing in a boardroom full of people in suits that cost more than her car. She noticed Callum Hargreave first, because he was the one standing, and because the room organized itself around him, the way rooms do around people who are used to being the center of them. She noticed the man across from him second, and then she heard the man across from him murmur something to his associate, and without making a decision about it, she understood every word. "Monsieur Fontaine," she said. Her French was Acadian, different music than Quebec French, a little rounder in the vowels, older in some of its rhythms, but she let it settle into something more neutral as she spoke. "Je m'excuse pour l'attente. Je comprends que vous avez des contraintes de temps ce matin." The room went very quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Fontaine turned and looked at her properly for the first time. His associate, Isabelle, looked up from her phone. The expression on the face of the man Wren would later learn was Hargreave's CFO was one she recognized. The specific recalibration that happens when someone revises their first impression so sharply it almost makes a sound. Hargreave crossed the room in 4 steps. He was taller up close, and he smelled like cedar and something expensive, and he looked at her with the direct, assessing attention of someone who had made a great deal of money by being right about people quickly. "Can you handle a contract negotiation?" he said. "Legal French. Quebec civil law. Energy sector." Wren looked at him for a moment. "I did my 2nd degree in civil law at Université de Montréal," she said. "I did it in French. I never practiced. I went back to New Brunswick for family reasons, and then I ended up here. But the vocabulary isn't going anywhere." She glanced toward Fontaine's side of the table. "What's the specific sticking point?" "The indemnity clauses under the force majeure provisions," Hargreave said. "Fontaine's team wants language that would effectively give them a unilateral exit option under climate event scenarios. My legal team says it's too broad. We need someone who can translate the positions without flattening the nuance." Wren looked at him. Then she looked at the table. Then she said, "I need to make a call to postpone my next delivery." She pulled her phone out in the hallway, called dispatch, listened to Marco say things she was not going to repeat, and walked back into the boardroom in under 4 minutes. It took her approximately 12 minutes to understand the full shape of the disagreement, which was actually not as complicated as it appeared from the outside. What Fontaine's team wanted was not a unilateral exit. It was a structured review mechanism triggered by defined climate benchmarks, which was a meaningfully different thing. What Hargreave's legal team had understood was the broader language of the original draft, which sanction clear to Wren said this in French to Fontaine. Then she said it in English to Hargreave. Then she said, when both men looked at her with variations of the same expression, the original clause in the draft used amendement climatique exceptionnel without a definition section. That's your problem. Fontaine's team is reading it as defined by the Régie de l'Énergie's existing benchmark categories. Your legal team is reading it as undefined. You're arguing about a word that means different things to each of you. Fontaine's lead counsel, a compact, precise man named Aubert, who had not said anything in 40 minutes, said something quickly in French. Wren translated without breaking stride. He says that's correct, and that the solution is to append a definition schedule that references the 2023 Régie framework document directly, which would actually narrow the clause considerably. Hargreave's CFO said, Is that right?" who was already pulling up something on his laptop with the slightly embarrassed energy of someone who should have seen this sooner. "That's right," the counsel said after a moment. "That would actually work in our favor. The 2023 framework is quite specific." Fontaine said something to Isabel, who smiled for the first time that morning. Wren said, "He says he'd be open to reviewing a revised draft with that language before 5 o'clock. She stayed for 2 hours and 40 minutes. In that time she translated 17 distinct exchanges, clarified 3 additional clauses that had secondary ambiguities once the first one was resolved, and ate half a sandwich that someone brought in without asking her, which she appreciated more than she expected to because it was almost noon, and she'd had a granola bar at 6. At one point, Fontaine's associate Isabel asked her, in French, whether she was cold. Someone had the air conditioning on high, and Wren said she was fine, and Isabel said that her French was beautiful. Where was she from? And Wren said originally Moncton, but she'd spent 3 years in Montreal. Isabel said something that made the other associate laugh. Wren told Hargreave, who was watching the exchange, "She says you have a secret weapon, and you didn't even know it." Hargreave looked at her. She looked back at him. He had a way of looking at people that was completely still and very direct, and she got the impression it was something he'd developed deliberately, because it was slightly too controlled to be natural. "No," he said. "I'm beginning to understand I have been very stupid." At 2:05, Fontaine's lead counsel signed the preliminary agreement on the revised language, with a commitment to final execution pending legal review in the next 72 hours. Fontaine himself stood, buttoned his jacket, crossed the room, and shook Wren's hand before he shook Hargreave's. He said something to her, quiet enough that not everyone in the room heard. She didn't translate that one right away. She held it for a moment. "What did he say?" Hargreave asked once the Quebec team had cleared the room. "He said he almost got on a plane 4 hours ago," Wren said. "He said the smartest person in the room was wearing a catering uniform, and nobody noticed until it was almost too late. She was zipping up the insulated bag in the hallway. The food had gone cold, but the bag itself was company property, and she was bringing it back when Hargreave came out of the boardroom. He'd put his jacket back on. He looked slightly different than he had that morning, though she couldn't have said exactly how. Something about the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his attention as he walked toward her. "I'd like to offer you something," he said. "You don't have to do that. I'm aware I don't have to. I want to." He stopped a few feet away. "What would be appropriate? I genuinely don't know what number we're starting from." Wren thought about it for a moment. "What's Paul Okafor's salary?" A pause. The CFO, who had followed Hargreave into the hallway without being invited, made a sound. "Why?" Hargreave said. "Because that's the job I just did. For 2.5 hours, so whatever you pay for that, prorated plus the cost of my deliveries for the afternoon, is the appropriate number." Hargreave said, That would be significant." "I know," Wren said pleasantly. "I'm a lawyer. I know how billing works." There was a moment. Hargreave said, "You're a lawyer who delivers catering." "I'm a lot of things," she said. "Some of them are on paper, some of them aren't." He looked at her for a long moment with that completely still attention. Then he said, "Are you currently employed somewhere that would prevent you from taking on additional work?" Wren thought about Marco. She thought about the scuff on her left knee. She thought about 3 years of hospital corridors and the particular specific exhaustion of trying to rebuild something after everything had gone quiet. "No," she said. "I have a situation in Calgary next week," Hargreave said. "French and English, corporate restructuring, some indigenous consultation components that will require cultural fluency I don't currently have in-house. It's 3 days. I'd pay you for 5 to compensate for the logistics. She looked at him. You don't know anything about me. I watched you work for 2.5 hours, he said. I know more about you than I know about most people I've employed for 5 years. A pause. Also, Priya ran your name through our system while you were in there. UNB, Université de Montréal, New Brunswick Bar Admission 2019, 3 years of absence, Toronto since 2022. No complaints, no flags. You ran a background check on me while I was translating your contracts. I had someone run a name search, he said. It's not the same thing. I can have the full check done with your consent if you're open to the conversation. Wren set the insulated bag on the floor. She put one hand on the strap and looked at Callum Hargreave, his jacket, his controlled attention, the 47-year lease that was now moving toward execution because she had spent eating half a sandwich and untangling a poorly drafted definition clause. My rate, she said, is not going to be comfortable for you. I don't need it to be comfortable, he said. I need it to be correct. The situation in Calgary was not 3 days, it ran to 6. The First Nations consultation component turned out to be significantly more complex than anyone had briefed her on, which she said to Hargreave on the second day in terms she was careful to keep professional, and he said he knew, and that was why he'd brought her. And she said that being told you're necessary after being insufficiently informed of the scope is not the same as being respected. And he said she was right, and he apologized. And she looked at him to see if he meant it. He did. She'd been in rooms with powerful people who apologized. Usually they did it quickly, with the energy of someone closing a bracket so they could move past it. Hargreave stopped entirely, looked at her directly, and said it without any of the forward momentum that made apologies performative. She filed that away. She also filed away that he had, without being asked, had the hotel booking changed, so that she and the lead consultant from the Calgary office, a woman named Dana, were in rooms with proper desk space and blackout curtains, because Wren had mentioned once, briefly, that she worked better in the dark. On the 4th day, during a break in the consultation sessions, she went down to the hotel restaurant to get tea. Hargreave was already there, alone, which was unusual. There was almost always someone with him. He looked up when she sat down across from him, which she did without asking because she was tired and the other chairs were taken. You're not sleeping, he said. I'm fine. I'm not asking if you're fine. I'm noting that you have been in this negotiation since 6 every morning, and you stay on the files until midnight. I'm not expecting that. I know you're not. She wrapped both hands around her mug. I'm like this. I've always been like this. When I'm in something, I'm in it. He nodded slowly. Outside the window, Calgary spread out flat and enormous under a sky that couldn't decide if it was winter yet. Why the delivery job, he said, not like he was judging. Like he actually wanted to know. Wren was quiet for a moment. My mother was sick for 3 years. I was in Moncton taking care of her. When she died, I was 30, and I had a law degree and a bar admission I'd let lapse and a body I didn't recognize in the mirror because stress eating is a real otherwise. She looked at her tea. I came to Toronto because I knew someone here and I needed a city that didn't know me yet. Delivery work it's good. Honest. You know exactly what you've done at the end of the day. Someone ordered food. It got there. That's a completed thing. She paused. I was going to start looking for articling positions again in the spring. Were? She looked up. Past tense, he said. She hadn't noticed she'd done that. I don't know what to make of you yet, she said, which was honest. That's reasonable, he said. I'm still working it out myself. Wren Mackay did not take the Calgary situation and consider it finished. She went home to her apartment in Leslieville, which was clean and small, and had an entire wall of books and a cat named after a Supreme Court justice, and she thought about it for about a week before she made any decisions. The decisions she made were, in order, she called the Law Society of Ontario to initiate reinstatement of her license. She emailed Hargreave Capital's General Counsel, not Hargreave himself with a fee schedule for freelance advisory and translation services. She sent the email on a Tuesday morning and had a response by noon because it turned out the General Counsel had already been asked to expect it. She found that out 2 days later when Hargreave himself called, not emailed, called, to say the terms were acceptable in Vancouver the following month that he'd like her to look at. "You had them expecting my email," she said. "I had them ready to receive it," he said. "That's not the same thing." She had the impression he was almost smiling. "You're going to be difficult," she said. "Probably," he said. "I've been told." The Vancouver situation was followed by one in Ottawa, and then a complicated 3-day arbitration in Fredericton that she hadn't expected to enjoy and found she couldn't stop thinking about afterward. By February, she had a proper client agreement with Hargreave Capital, a rate that had, in fact, been uncomfortable and then become correct, and a reputation in the company as the person you called when the file was complicated in a way that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. She also had Callum Hargreave texting her about a documentary he'd watched about hydroelectric engineering in Norway, apparently because he'd thought of her in the middle of it and hadn't thought too hard about whether that was something he should say. She texted back, "I watched that 2 years ago. The segment on the Orland development is better than most academic papers on the subject." He'd texted back, "I know. I had to read 3 academic papers to understand the segment." She'd laughed in her kitchen at midnight, and the cat had looked at her with the deeply unbothered contempt that cats reserve for humans who make noise at unreasonable hours. In March, Hargreave Capital's communications team put together a profile piece for a trade publication, standard company profile, nothing unusual, and Priya emailed Wren to ask if she'd be comfortable being included as a featured advisor. Wren sat with the email for a day before she responded. Then she thought about the woman she'd been in that boardroom in October. Catering bag on the floor, polo shirt, scuff on her left knee, and the particular quality of having walked into a room that wasn't designed with her in mind, in a body that wasn't what the room expected, with a mind that turned out to be exactly what the room needed. She wrote back, yes. The profile ran in April. The photograph was her idea. Not the boardroom, not a posed corporate shot, but the hallway outside, the one she'd walked down that first morning, not knowing what she was walking into. She was wearing a blazer she'd bought in February, and her hair was up, and she was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not performing anything. The caption under it, which she also wrote, read, "Wren Mackay, Strategic Advisor and Legal Consultant, Hargreave Capital, joined the team in October." She did not mention the catering bag. She did not have to. Callum Hargreave called her the morning the piece ran before she'd had coffee. "The caption," he said. "I know," she said. "Joined the team in October," he said, and she could hear that he was not quite smiling and also that he was. "You didn't say anything about how." "No," she said. "Any particular reason?" She looked out her kitchen window at the April light coming off the lake, pale and particular, the kind of light that meant the city was finally deciding to warm up again. She thought about Fontaine shaking her hand before he shook Hargreave's. She thought about the 47-year lease and the sandwich and the definition schedule and the moment in the hallway when she'd set the insulated bag down and not picked it up again. "Because the how isn't the point," she said. "The point is that I'm here." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that has something in it. "Yes," Callum Hargreave said, and she could hear clearly now that he was smiling and that he meant it in at least 2 ways. "You are."